From time to time, people ask a very basic question about carnivore diets and things like that. And it's that, why is it that human beings seem to be the only creatures on the planet that have a hard time figuring out what it is we're supposed to eat? Discounting domesticated animals, which we've trained to eat whatever it is we give them. And frankly, most of them don't eat a proper species-appropriate diet either. I mean, you ever looked at what's in cat food? You think cats are supposed to eat meat-flavored grain? Probably not. But why is it humans have such a hard time compared to other animals? And there's a basic answer to this problem. We didn't have that big of a problem. We like to point out that cavities and things are a sign that, human beings shouldn't have been eating grains and fruits and plants and things going back to, the dawn of the age of agriculture. But even when if you discount that idea, but look at more recent history, it's only in like the 20th century, really, that human beings had a hard time with basic nutrition. And again, there's a couple other, external factors to this we should, of course, keep in mind. Any student of history knows that urban living up until like the 20th century was, in the age of electricity, was not ideal. That people who lived in cities often couldn't get fresh milk, fresh dairy products, fresh meat, anything fresh. They ate out of cans. And that has more to do with the fact that urbanization is one of the reasons we have such a hard time finding out what we should, figuring out what we should eat. Because human beings, quite frankly, are not meant to live in giant hives like cities. It's just not good for us. That's one of the reasons. And it creates a whole host of problems, including the invention of processed foods was a direct result of urbanization. Any student of history will tell you that. But the reason really we have such a hard time figuring out what to eat is because there's a number of factors, and some of these won't be terribly popular with people. But the first is the advent of modernity itself, industrialization. Look, we all love sugar, right? If you're on a carnivore diet, a lot of you are on a carnivore diet because you love sugar too much. You want to break its hooks from you. You want to get away from sugar. Because when you eat it, man, it's wonderful. So wonderful, in fact, that maybe you lose self-control. Or maybe even if you don't lose self-control, your body just starts storing it like crazy. Case in point from my own life. I once went on this extreme calorie tracking test to see, what foods would cause me a problem. And this is where I first encountered the Randall cycle. I could eat textbook healthy standard American diet and keep my calories to what was considered appropriate for me at my activity level, and it'd be fine generally. Wouldn't gain any weight. But then you can give me like a kid's Frosty or like a milkshake or something, a kid's size one. And I could have a couple spoonfuls of it and I'd gain weight. It was the craziest thing. Even if on paper I wasn't consuming enough calories to gain weight. That's just one example of this. It's modernity. Part of it is modernity. We love sugar so much and its effects on us are crazy. It was only until modern times that we had sugar in abundance. I mean, look, if you go back into human history, sugar was a delicacy. Sugar was something that most people couldn't get very often. The average consumption of sugar for human beings was pretty steady throughout history. Even the elites consumed a tiny fraction of the percent of the sugar that we consume today. And when they did, it was often in the form of honey and fruit. Refined sugar was hard to come by because it was such an expensive process to do. Now it's easy to do. We have 50 different plants that can produce produce sugar that we refine. So that's part of it, the abundance of sugar as a consequence of modernity. And then there's, of course, also the advent of processed foods itself. Processed sugars being one of the first processed foods, but then we got processed plant oils as a cheap substitute. And we love convenience, especially in the modern world where people work longer hours, longer than any time in human history. I mean, that is a fact. Modern man works more than in previous times in history. And we've got a lot of, the fruits of our labors speak for themselves on that. But one of the consequences for that is that we seek convenience. And so processed foods fill in the blank for us. That's another consequence of that's another reason why we have such a hard time. It's just there's an abundance of foods that might have been better relegated as feasting foods at best, if not, or only emergency use only kind of food. Like you're stuck in your house in a snowstorm for 2 weeks, so at least you've got something to eat in the form of a hamburger helper or whatever. But there's also another thing there's other two things people might take a little bit of umbrage with, and the first is the mass media. You'll recall that it was President Dwight Eisenhower, who had a heart attack in the late 1950s, and that sort of set off a chain reaction of events that led to government action, which is the other part of this. We live in a time where, for whatever reason, we allow mass media and the government to influence our decisions. Before the modern era, the idea of government issuing nutritional guidelines would have sounded absurd. What business was it of government to tell people 5 servings of fruit and 12 servings of grains a day? It made no sense, especially when you factor in the role of the agricultural lobbyists into the government practices. But combine that with mass media, and all of a sudden you've got these messages pounding on people all the time. Now, not everybody follows government guidelines for nutrition. I mean, obviously, if you're watching this channel, you don't. I keep to a carnivore diet, and despite the fact that my health is right now some of the worst it's ever been, simply because of stress, keeping to a carnivore diet, my body weight is not moving in any good direction right now. I managed to keep it from getting worse. Most people, though, generally will do what the TV tells them when it comes to nutrition, and most of your media outlets will tell you basically the government line. Go look at most of what the real fad diets were from the past few years before keto kind of smashed that to pieces. I remember when people called keto diets a fad diet, but keto has now been in the public eye basically since the late 2000s. That's a little long for a fad diet, and now carnivore is coming in as sort of like the ultimate version of a ketogenic diet. But you remember some of the older fad diets like South Beach and some of these other things, most of them were just representations of a standard American diet. I mean, I'll even make the case that a paleo diet isn't that different than a standard American diet. It's just free of processed foods. You're still getting a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of clean proteins and a lot of that. Although there's nothing in a paleo diet that says you can't eat a ribeye steak if you want to. But a lot of these diets are just standard American diet. So government does play a bigger role in our lives now than it has ever before. And I will disagree with a lot of conservative folks when they say that they're about small governments, because you can't have a small government in a country with 300 million people. You just can't. It just doesn't make sense. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that government has any business issuing nutritional guidelines for people. If they want to issue nutritional guidelines for people in the military and nutritional guidelines for people in the jail system, that's their business at that point. But beyond that, why does anybody listen to nutritional guidelines from the government when it's pretty obvious that obesity gets worse and worse and worse in the United States and in Europe and in these other places? And a lot of people admit they try to follow nutritional guidelines. So why is it that they follow them? I don't know, but it's one of the reasons. And I suspect they actually follow it because of the mass media effect. Next time, if you've got the time, if you're one of those people who actually are able to do this, go watch some of those news morning shows that are on broadcast television, like NBC, ABC, CBS, those, Good Morning America kind of things. And they sometimes have people who come on and show people how to make healthy meals. And you're going to notice something about those healthy meals. They basically fit onto the My Plate, which is the latest version of the food pyramid put out by the U.S. government. They fit those nutritional guidelines. Can you imagine if they had, say, Dr. Sean Baker go on to Good Morning America and show them how to cook a healthy meal? He wheeled out his Auto Wild grill, plopped down a 3-pound tomahawk ribeye onto a cutting board, and proceeded to eat it on television while telling people how great a carnivore diet is and how, he's in the top 1% of athletes in the world now because of his diet at his age. Can you imagine what would happen if they did that? Of course they won't do that. But people ask, why do we have such a hard time with nutrition when no other animal in the world does? And it's pretty simple. It's because of complications of modernity, including mass media and the role of government in our lives. It's as simple as that, folks. And this is how we can, the more we learn about this stuff, the more we accept it, the more we can push back on it. And maybe, learn to just sort of tune out government voices when it comes to this stuff and sort of chuckle when the mass media tells us that we need 13 servings of complex carbohydrates, as if that's going to do anything good for you except rot your teeth out and pad your waistline. What other effects do you think are at the cause of us having such problems to, find what we should be eating as human beings? So let me know in the comments. And like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to share on this social media, that helps too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for tuning in.